Hello everyone and welcome to Cinematic Smartphone Techniques as part of Cruinniú 2020. My name is Lucy Dawson and I'm a filmmaker based in Limerick City. And today what I'd really like to do is to help you to get to know your smartphones, to guide you through some video settings, some apps, some equipment and some techniques just so that you can work out how to get the best footage possible from your smartphone. Smartphones have come a long way in the past few years, and the footage is just getting better and better all the time. But there is still some sort of filmmaking techniques that you can use with a little bit of technical knowledge, a little bit of technical understanding to get the best quality possible that you can't quite achieve just by picking up your phone and just pointing it at your subject. So you just need to have a smartphone. It doesn't have to be a really new and fancy one. For this workshop, for the examples that we were using, we used two particular smartphones. One of them was this one, which is the iPhone SE. Now this is the old iPhone SE, the original one released around about 2016-17. And we also had a Hawaii P8 Lite, which is again similar. So it's similar release date. It was around about 2016-17, I believe, when it came out as well. So they're not the newest, shiniest phones. Which is a good thing. So let you see what is possible to get from these kinds of phones even now. So you just need to have your own smartphone handy. Now obviously we're going to be showing you some equipment and gear and things that you won't necessarily have. But it's just about letting you see what's possible. And then you can decide for yourself if you want to invest a little bit in some gear when you have a kind of clear understanding of the kind of footage that these accessories, that these apps and things are going to get you. So you don't need to have them now. Some things will just require you looking through your phone just to find where certain settings are so that you can utilize them. Now obviously we use the Huawei, I'm pronouncing that correctly, in order to have both an iPhone and an Android. Now I know Androids can have a lot of different layouts and things, so apologies that we can't kind of cater for all Android phones, but hopefully the settings should be similar enough so you can at least know where to go looking for them. In addition to this, we also had a little bit of gear that we were working with. So we had the Huawei P8 Lite, we had our iPhone SE. We had a couple of different tripods. So we had a small tripod and we had a full-size tripod. We had a gimbal. The particular ones that we were using were the DJI Osmo Mobile 2 and we also had a Mobile 3. We utilised a couple of different lights and we also were using the Filmic Pro app, which is an app that you can download to your smartphone. It's not a free app. It's $16.99 in euros at the moment, but we're going to show you what you can achieve with this app, and I think it's completely worth it. So right now during the workshop, myself and my partner Shane are going to be available for a live Q&A on the Fresh Film Festival's Facebook page. So if anyone has any questions, as I'm sure you might after we go through, start getting into all the technical details, we'll be available there if you want to ask any questions. So let's get started. The very first thing that we have to delve into is how you're holding your phone. So you've got two options here. You have landscape and you have portrait mode. When these, what's called the aspect ratio, are played on a standard 16:9 device in widescreen, that you get very small footage. It's very narrow, it's very thin, and it's useful for some things. It's become very prevalent in social media, in sharing. It's very useful for video chatting, because it displays the face very clearly and very well. If you had it sort of sideways, the face would take up less of the screen, whereas it really does fill the screen. It's called portrait mode for a reason, because it's shaped like a portrait. And there are a lot of social media apps and methods of sharing, things like, IGTV with Instagram, WhatsApp, all these kind of different things that you can kind of use. The portrait mode is very social media. It doesn't quite translate to looking cinematic. When you start getting into more cinematic aspect ratios, which we're going to go into, really, I would like you guys to start filming this way. So if you're serious about creating some really beautiful imagery, I would like you to film in landscape mode. Yeah. So here's a couple of examples of us moving into landscape mode. You're getting much more of the scene. And the other thing about this is that it much more closely resembles the way we see the world. Just if you just kind of just generally think about your vision as it's sitting in your own head, we have more width and expanse in terms of our vision than we have up and down. And that's largely to do with the position of our eyes. They're wide apart, they're side by side. So we have this sense of expanse. We have a lot more peripheral vision than we have up and down. Yeah. So if I move my hands, you can try this yourself. My fingertips don't come into my vision until about here. I can't see my fingertips until there. Whereas sideways, I can see them already there. So we've got this much more wider sort of sense of awareness than we have up and down. When you film in that manner and when you produce content in that sort of shape, it allows the audience to immerse themselves more fully in the images that you're providing them with. It lets them kind of sit back and just take in the scene the same way that you would with your eyes, with this amount of space available to you. So when you're thinking about creating imagery that's more cinematic, then filming in a landscape is absolutely integral. So aspect ratios are basically the shape of the frame. Yeah, so let's just have a little look at a few examples. Now there are way more aspect ratios than this. There are way more that exist. And people can be quite experimental with them. They can use them in different ways. There are some sort of standards that we know and understand. The 16:9 actually, which is the shape and size of most videos these days, and also the shape and size of the screen that most of us have on our phones and on our laptops and on our HD TVs, actually came about as a result of two different aspect ratios. 4:3, which is your standard definition television, your old school television screens. The other aspect ratio was 2.39, 35mm anamorphic. Now the reason that 16:9 came about is because 16:9 is a sort of aspect ratio which provides an equal sort of measure of view between those two. So if you have a screen, for example, that's 16:9, it's going to allow a little bit of letterboxing for 3:2 and a little bit of letterboxing for the other width. If you had a screen that was too wide, then your 4:3 footage is going to be really tiny. If you have a footage that's too square, then your widescreen footage is going to be really tiny. So the 16:9 was allowing people to view these different commonly used aspect ratios as fully as possible. And when that was created, they then started creating footage for that particular shape so that you could fill the whole screen. So that is why we have this standard of 16:9 currently. So if you want this sort of cinematic look, I would definitely be filming in landscape mode, but also seeing if you can film with this cinematic aspect ratio. So our aspect ratio is the shape of our frame, you know, whether it's a square or whether it's a widescreen. The resolution is the quality of that frame, so how big that frame is. And resolution in particular is to do with size. It's to do with the size, and it's measured in pixels. So let's have a little look at some resolution examples to understand just what that means. And then I'm going to show you where you can try and find those settings in your smartphone and why you might want to pick certain ones. So right now I'm having a look at the iPhone resolution settings that are available. And I'm doing a little comparison here to show you in terms of the number of pixels, how different the size is between these different ones. So we start off with 720, we've now moved into our 1080 and moving then into our 4K. So the numbers here, let's just go back. The numbers indicated here on the screen, so 1280 by 720, that's is often abbreviated to 720. People just talk about 720 or HD. That means that there are 1280 pixels across and 720 pixels down. So both 720 and 1080 are abbreviated by their vertical pixel count. 4K, however, is abbreviated by its horizontal pixel count in order to appear larger comparatively. There are two resolutions commonly referred to as 4K. The first is the 16:9 version we recognise. The second is a cinematic version, which is a little bit wider, at 4090 pixels across. And this is where the name 4K comes from, so it means over 4000. So let's keep having a little look. So those are the the aspect ratio is shown comparatively, so you can see how much bigger it is. But let's just fill the screen. So now this is 720, but sort of magnified, basically. It's sort of blown up on the screen. So we haven't had any more information, we're just playing it full screen. So now you can see the slight sort of increase in quality visually when they're side by side. And then again with 4K, slightly richer information. There's just more information contained in the same space. Now we're going to go into our Android and iPhone resolution. I'm going to add a few of the Android ones. Now Android has 720 and it has 1080, but I'm just going to use some of their smaller available settings so you can see, yeah, the comparison between that and 4K is pretty huge. Let's just have a little watch of these in terms of number of pixels. So the Android actually still has these settings available should you require. So it's 144, 240. So these are absolutely tiny. So these are the number of pixels across compared to your presented within a 4K frame, showing you comparatively the increasing number of pixels as we get into our higher and higher resolutions. So this is showing you pixel by pixel. I've calculated all of these out. The difference between the amount of pixels involved in each one of these. So what I'm going to show you now are these same images but played in full screen. So this is our Android 144 played in our full screen. So when you blow it right up and try and fill a 4K frame with these resolutions, this is where you can really see the difference in quality. So there's different amounts of information, but trying to compress them all into the same amount of space, and that's where you can see where these real differences start to apply. So we're getting now into our 4K territory, and you can really see the differences. Not all resolutions are the same. So 1080 is not the same on every single camera, it's not the same on every single device, it's not the same on every single setting. So let's just have a little look. So let's have a look at 720. This is our Android HD. It's the same number of pixels. And this is our 720 in the iPhone. Very different colors, very different look. This is 720 in our Filmic Pro app. So it's still the iPhone, but it's starting to go into our Filmic Pro, and it's our extreme quality. Now we're going into 1080 with the Android, our full HD, and then the iPhone. And then finally going into Filmic Pro one more time in what is known as the Filmic Pro Extreme Quality. So it's a much higher bitrate, but it's on the same phone. So the iPhone is the native app that comes with the iPhone, and then the Filmic Pro app basically opens up your phone to do more things, basically. So now we have your resolution settings. Now where do you find them? So I'm just going to give you a few ideas of the types of quality settings that are available on your phone, but where are they? So let's start with our version of the Android that we had. So in this one, you had to swipe to the side in the app itself, and it shows you all these different resolutions that are available, and you can choose which one is right for you. And then it's as simple as that. Within the iPhone, you have to go into your settings, and within your settings, you then access the settings of your camera. So let's just find our camera, which is here. Then you've got record video. When you click on record video, you can see the different number of settings available. So within Filmic Pro, you access, it's the dial at the bottom, and then you go into resolution. And within resolution, you can see here you've got a number, so it's standard definition, HD, 720. It's got a number of 2K and 3K options there as well. I don't kind of go into them too often, I'm kind of featuring mainly the standard ones. But within each one, within every single resolution option, there's also 4 different quality options. So within HD, you've got 4 different amounts of quality that you can apply. And then at the top here, this is where we've got our aspect ratios. In 1080 HD, you've got 4 different quality options, and you've got 8 different aspect ratio options. So there's an infinite number of possibilities available. So we've seen where we found them now. So let's have a look at the Filmic Pro resolutions. So this is 540. And within 540, this is QHD, so it's a quarter of HD. Within each resolution, you've got 4 different quality standards. So let's just cycling through them all, each one with increasing quality. So 1080, economy, Apple standard, Filmic quality, Filmic extreme is like the most amount of quality it can pack in. And then our 4K. So just watching the increasing amount of information that this sensor is packing into these images. Let's go from 720 to 4K. Yeah, so if you're filming at 720, then you might be doing that because you don't have a lot of space, but you've got a lot of footage that you need to get, you know? And if that's the case, it's more important that you get your shots. It's more important that you get your footage. So make sure that you get them. Film in 720 if you have to. If you've got enough space, and for example, it might be shown on a projector or on a larger screen, even on your laptop, you'll start to see the difference. Then shooting in 1080 or even in 4K, you're going to get nicer quality footage. So, how many people, put up your hands, I can see you, have been filming on their phones, whichever way there is, and in order to zoom in, you've done this to zoom in, yeah? Now doing that is going to just cut your resolution in half. It's going to massively reduce the amount of quality that you have available. It's not as bad with photos, but even then it's not the best. And I'm going to show you for why. So by doing this on your phone, what you're essentially doing is you're taking the image and you're zooming into that image. So you're basically blowing it up onto the screen. You're not gaining any new information. And what you're going to end up with is an image that is a quarter of the resolution of your original shot. So let's just show you this again. So it's the equivalent of taking 1080 footage, cropping it to 540, and then blowing it up onto the screen. So you're getting a quarter of the resolution, a quarter of the quality. That's the amount of information that should be on your screen. So here's a little example here of me showing here. So we've got our shot here that we filmed indoors. It becomes even more apparent indoors with less light available. So that's a cropped in digital crop of the image. This time, rather than digitally cropping in, physically moving to get the shot that you want. So let's just do a little side-by-side comparison of the digital zoom and the physical zoom. And hopefully you guys can see just how extreme the difference is there. Just this shot here. So we've physically moved closer. So in terms of resolution, your zoom is hugely important. So if you want a closer shot, move closer. Yeah, as much as you can. And you're going to get the much better quality image from your phone than you will if you digitally zoom. It's better to get a wider shot in gorgeous resolution than it is to digitally zoom and have imagery that's going to be really fuzzy and really low quality. You get a lot of iPhones now that have got multiple cameras on them. Some of them have got like your wide and your extra wide, your wide, extra wide and telephoto. You know, they're slightly more expensive phones these days. They utilize a different kind of zoom called optical zoom. And that's got nothing to do with the, our kind of scrolling in. It's nothing to do with the crop of the image itself. It's to do with different lenses bending the light in different ways. So the sensor is still fully utilized. So you're getting the most amount of quality out of your sensor as possible. And you do it by switching between different lenses. We're going to have a look at why exposure is so important. You might be all familiar with this kind of thing. When you're moving around a scene, the auto exposure basically is deciding from that scene what the light levels should be, and it's constantly changing if you're moving around the shot. This is now us locking the exposure. It's your auto exposure and your autofocus lock, so it locks the two together. This is auto exposure on Filmic Pro. So again, it's really similar. It's going to keep doing this when you start looking into the dark areas and then looking down into the bright areas. You can see how vastly different this is. And then when you lock your exposure, you set it at a point and then move around the scene. You can see that it starts to look much more natural. So yes, auto exposure is for me one of the primary things that makes footage look like you haven't thought about it. And one of the main reasons is when we look around the room, when we look around a scene, our eyes don't do what that camera just did. When you move from here to here, it doesn't suddenly get super bright and suddenly get super dark. Now there is a degree to which your eyes are making those subtle adjustments without you realizing. But your eyes have a much wider dynamic range than these cameras have, so you're not going to get that kind of look. So when you have a look like that again that looks very mechanical, it looks like something a device is doing, and it doesn't look like something your eyes could do, then it immediately takes you out of that experience. So again, with a cinematic experience, the idea is that you're immersing your audience into this world, and in order to do that, you've really got to get your exposure looking gorgeous. So let's just look at where we find our exposure settings on our phones. So this is having a look at the iPhone now. So this is just in the iPhone's native app, and we're opening on our video settings, and there's this little square, yellow square, that you can use to adjust your exposure up and down. But even if you do adjust your exposure up and down, it'll still move as you move with your scene. So we're going to try and find an area which is sort of somewhere between our light and our dark, and then you touch and hold the screen until this AEAF, which is auto exposure and autofocus lock, appears. Now once you've locked that, it does both the exposure and the focus together, which has its sort of disadvantages as well. But now just having a basic scan around the room, you can see that it's no longer making adjustments all the time for every single scene. So this is one of the major advantages of Filmic Pro, is that your auto exposure and your autofocus, well, your exposure and your focus, whether auto or manual, are separate. So you can have your focus set in one place, and then you can have your exposure doing something else. So the exposure is the circle. When it's auto exposed, it's white, and when it's locked, it's red. So you can see there now, moving around the scene, how vastly different it is when you can look around the scene and it will basically look like what your eyes see. In addition to this, you can also manually adjust the exposure by touching and holding the circle. This will open up your ISO and your shutter speed settings, which is what your camera uses to determine your overall exposure. Now this one here is the Android. So we've got in the standard video app, you just basically touch and hold, and that's kind of like your auto exposure and autofocus again. You can't lock it though, which is really annoying. In the Pro video mode, you can't lock it either. It's one of the disadvantages of this particular phone, but there are different metering modes available. So a little kind of breakdown on those. This one here at the end is a sort of matrix or evaluative metering. It basically reads the whole scene, tries to work out what it thinks the exposure is, and then you can use this little dial here, exposure value, to, if you don't like the decisions it's making, you can basically make it brighter or darker. This is our spot metering. So spot metering is basically wherever you touch the screen, that's going to create the spot that it's going to determine it by. And that will move when you move around the scene as well. So it's fine for stationary shots or if you're tracking your subject, but again, it becomes very, very challenging if you're moving around a scene where your lighting levels are going to be very different. This one's our center weighted. And to be honest, on this phone, that was the best option. The center weighted option on the Android phone. It sort of looked at what was in the scene, but then also takes into consideration what's outside of it. And as a result of that, it'll try and find the best balance. It's really frustrating that this particular phone, you cannot lock the exposure. I'm sure that there are other Android phones that can, just this particular phone didn't. So now we've got our exposure more or less sorted, we need to have a look at our focus. And just like our exposure, like our auto exposure, our focus can run into some interesting behavior when it's not set manually. Things like pulsing, kind of back and forth. So we need to know how to set our focus. So the native camera app in the Apple phone, you adjust your focus automatically just by touching the screen on your areas where you want them to be in focus. It adjusts both the exposure and the focus together, which is useful in some ways, but for video it doesn't really look the best going from bright to dark all the time. You can set your exposure, you can kind of lift your exposure up and down, and once you kind of found that, you can lock your focus in the same way that you lock your exposure by touching and holding. So if I pan to the side here, you can see that it doesn't refocus on the background. It maintains that front focus that we just set there. So you can see what that does. So in this example, we have our autofocus still running. So when the subject moves into the square, the camera app should instinctively refocus on that new subject and then revert back to whatever's now in the screen and then revert forward again. And then conversely, You also then have the option to set your focus, say, on the background. And then when your subject moves into that space, back into that square, it shouldn't refocus. It should maintain that kind of area. So it does give you that element of control over where your focus lies when your shot's fairly stable. Now let's have a little look at the Android app. Within these here, you've got different focus options available. This is our manual focus. This is in the Pro video. So it lets you slide forward and back. Now this is our autofocus continuous. It's a little clunky. You can see it just keeps kind of pulsing as you move in and out. But autofocus continuous tries to keep whatever is in the circle that you've touched on the screen, tries to keep that in focus. Autofocus set. This one here is basically where you can set your autofocus and you can move around the scene, but you've set it already, so it's not going to do what it just did there before with its pulsing and it's adjusting in order to do this. Now in Filmic Pro, the circle is the exposure, the square is your focus. If you touch and hold the square, you can use it manually. So you can set your exposure separately, and then you can just touch the screen, drag it around to again pull focus between different objects nice and cleanly. Now there's a little bit of movement in the screen, you can see that. Another fun thing Filmic Pro has got is this thing called focus peaking, which is, it sort of detects the contrast in the scene and it shows you what's in focus nice and clearly. So let's just have a little look at what's called a focus pull. So it's where you pull your focus from one object or from one part of the scene to another part of the scene. This is using Filmic Pro. Apologies for the shake in this one, I hadn't stabilized it. So you can see pulling focus, the focus moves from the front to the back. And that's another example, a little bit closer. So you can really see cameras blurry, backgrounds in focus, and conversely, moving back and forth. Now, this is a problem that we have with the autofocus of the iPhone app that exists already, in that it adjusts your exposure and your focus together. Now this is not ideal, as you can see. So when I touch the screen, just involves touching the screen, you can see what happens, and it does not look very nice. And it's one of the major flaws I have found in the native camera app of the iPhone. In Filmic Pro, they've done it beautifully by having your exposure and your focus separate. So you can set your exposure for the whole scene, and then you can pull your focus back and forth between the two, which really is the ideal situation. And it's where you'll get that lovely focus pull, whereas like you're getting bright and dark and bright and dark. Again, your eyes don't do that. The next thing we're going to go into is stabilization. So what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to just sit here for a moment and I'd like you to shake your head. Maybe look at something straight ahead of you and try shaking your head. And I want you to see, you know, the type of motion that kind of happens as a result. Move your head around. Look from side to side, quickly, or up and down. Swirl it around. No matter how kind of fast you move your head or how jerky you move your head, you do not get the same kind of jitter that you get from hand holding your camera. Yeah? It just doesn't happen. We have incredible stabilization present within our head and within our eyes. Everything floats around in liquid. Yeah? So as a result of that, when you don't stabilize your camera, you end up with footage that looks like this. So when you just hand hold your phone, it doesn't matter how careful you're trying to hold your phone still, especially if you're holding onto the device itself, it's going to be really, really hard to get footage that doesn't look mechanical. Our eyes don't do this. They don't shake like this. I've got to say the iPhone handled handheld quite well. I do think there might be a little bit of image stabilization present in this particular device. Again, I'm fairly stationary, not moving too much, just trying to keep it level. With no image stabilization, you're going to get a kind of shake that your eyes do not have. And that's why you need to look at some sort of stabilization. Now, there's lots of different methods. The first one here I've said is small tripod. I have my phone in a small tripod. So rather than it being sat on a table, folded out, it's basically, so I'm taking the shake out of the device. When I'm handheld, all the shake is right here. You at least just kind of use a smaller tripod or a smaller device or even like a selfie stick, just by taking that out of here. This one's quite a nice one, it's nice and heavy. When you take it out of the phone and move it around, keep it close to the body. It's a nice one for that one there. You're going to get footage that's a lot smoother, generally. It might just be a little bit smoother, but it does help. So let's just have a little look. Now our iPhone here. It's not too bad. It looks a little bit more floaty, so it's not too bad. It's done quite a good job just to kind of take the edge of the shake out. Though I have to say, I do think the iPhone must have a degree of stabilization involved, even in this older phone. Most of the newer ones do. They have optical stabilization. Now let's have a look at a fixed tripod. Now obviously it's going to keep it pretty still. This is a pan on the tripod. It's having fun with its autofocus at the moment. But the motion is not too bad. So same thing, we've got a fixed frame. So it looks nicely composed. So in our iPhone's native app. And then a nice little pan there with a tripod. So now we're going to utilize what's called a gimbal. Now, just to show you what a gimbal looks like. They don't all look the same. They all look a little bit like this. You have your phone balanced in the gimbal. Let's get it nice and steady. Turning it on. And this is going to keep your phone super steady. You can set it to pan with you. It keeps it nice and level. This one will let you move around a little bit more, and it won't adjust with you as well. So gimbals use a series of motors to stabilize the camera, and it keeps it really steady, steadier than your arms can get, way steadier. The particular gimbal that we're using is the Osmo. It's a little off balance, you can kind of see slightly there, but it's doing a nice job of just keeping it nice and floaty. Now I'd say the kind of gimbal is sort of the closest that we have to our own innate stabilization that we have in our own heads, which is sort of slightly floaty. We're not very still. We don't tend to stay very still. We tend to move around. We tend to like look at different things, you know. There are a lot of phones now which have image stabilization of some kind integrated into your phone. Older ones like the ones we were using do not have, although I have to say that the iPhone is behaving suspiciously well in the handheld test. But optical and I'm having a look at electronic stabilization because the Filmic Pro app provides it. So we're going to show you how it works. So basically, if you have a phone that doesn't have image stabilization as part of it, by downloading the Filmic Pro app, you can access this particular feature. So I'm just going to show you how it works. So this is electronic image stabilization as opposed to optical, but it behaves in a very similar way. So if we take the frame, and let's say, for example, we were taking our entire image and filling the sensor with this information. If you were then to sort of take, this is what digital image stabilization does, is it kind of tries to compensate for the movement involved in the shot by moving the frame in relation to the movement of the camera. Now, obviously we just saw there that there were, it moves right out of the frame. So what you tend to do with image stabilization generally is that you crop the image in order that you can move it and compensate for the movement without cutting off the image. That is generally how both electronic and optical stabilization to a degree sort of work. Both of them have a degree of crop. They'll crop your image in so you don't get as much field of view. You'll have a slightly narrower shot. So on here I'm going to show you the Filmic Pro handheld and then with the electronic stabilization enabled. So we have Filmic Pro handheld, so you can see the shakiness of the camera. I'm trying really hard to hold it still. And that is the electronic stabilization applied. So that's just in the app. So it's moving the image around digitally to try and compensate for the shake of my hands, and it's doing an incredible job. You'd have two kinds. One is electronic image stabilization, which was this kind, which is what you would get with Filmic Pro. And then a lot of phones now, like the iPhones, the newer ones, have optical image stabilization, which is where the lens itself will move in some capacity. It still requires a little bit of that crop, so that again, that the imagery can kind of move around the sensor and still fit in the frame. So they function very, very similarly. The electronic image stabilization is the one you get with Filmic Pro, and I have to say it's really, really good. So if you have a phone that doesn't have that, it will give you that just by having the app. And it really does a great job. In this particular image stabilization test, I was very still. It wasn't moving very much. I was trying really hard to stay very still and just lightly panning. So we're going to give it more of a test now to sort of see. So this is our walking stabilization challenges. So how do you get, again, the kind of imagery that your eyes see while you're walking? So this is handheld with the Android phone, and you can see straight away the shakiness, the slight jerkiness. It has an aesthetic. You know, there's some people who really like this look. It gives you the look of certain kind of indie films that wouldn't have had access to stabilizers, would have filmed in this way. So there's an aesthetic that we kind of understand and can engage with. This is me doing a similar thing, but with the small tripod in hand, which isn't as effective, I have to say, when you're walking. Now look at the difference. The exposure again has gone off on one, but this is the gimbal. This is the mechanical gimbal that we have. And there's a little bit of bounce. I'm still kind of getting used to it, but the imagery is just so much smoother. So another couple of angles to show you the kind of shots that you can get using the gimbal. And this is all on the Android. This is the Android phone. So already the stabilization kind of to a degree improves the sort of the quality, the look of the imagery that you're getting. And it's mainly because it more closely resembles what our eyes see. So it takes us out of this, it takes us out of the mechanics. It takes us away from knowing that there's a camera operator behind this camera and lets us just see the image, which is great. So this is our electronic image stabilization now in action in our handheld. This is it with it off, Filmic Pro. So obviously walking, it's creating a lot of camera shake. This is on our iPhone. And then this is with the electronic image stabilization on. It's not bad. It's doing a pretty good job. It just takes that little bit of shake out. And then this is now with the gimbal. So here's a little compilation I put together just to sort of demonstrate the optimal settings for your stabilization in a more filmic way. So that was looking at beginning to combine these tools that we have. So using the higher quality resolution of the Filmic Pro, getting our nice aspect ratio, so it's looking more cinematic. We've got our lighting sorted, we've got our focus fixed, and now we're getting our image stabilization sorted. So the quality of the imagery, hopefully you can see, is starting to really kick into gear. One other tiny little aspect of stabilization I just want to give a little kind of nod to is the idea of using, beginning to use slow motion as a stabilizing effect. So just have a little look here. So this is filming, and we're going to talk about frame rates now. This is 60p. Maybe you guys have kind of seen these settings on your phones. We're going to have a little look at these now. So this is 60p footage slowed down. So at half speed, you can see the image just looks a lot smoother. So you can use slow motion settings, which we're going to talk about now, in order to provide a bit of image stabilization. Now, it will mean that the motion is not going to be natural. It's not going to look, real-time speed. It will look, kind of slightly softer, slightly more kind of slow. But if you're in a situation where you don't have access to stabilizing gear, stabilizing equipment, you could choose to shoot your video in a slow motion, using slow motion as your aesthetic, in order to get some nice quality shots from your device. So in order to get into slow motion fully, now most of you have probably seen your slow motion setting on your camera in some way. We are going to talk about that, where you find those settings. And again, maybe just point it and shoot it and use it to jump in the air, or to kind of, run down the street, run at the camera. But I want to really talk about why it has the effect that it has, and how you can use that, again, how you can use the understanding of these numbers that we're translating in order to get some really, really beautiful slow motion shots. So frame rates were originally generated using film strips. So when film strips were being exposed, it was the number of photographs basically that were taken for every second of time. In order for the motion to be played back smoothly, those images would be speeded up. So over time, they gradually realized that 24 frames per second was the sort of optimal number of photographs that you needed to take for every second of motion in order for imagery to look nice and smooth and continuous, and so we could absorb it in the same way that we absorb sort of the movement of life. Faster frame rates are also, as we come to realize, effective at doing this, but back in the day, it would have been very, very expensive to take loads and loads of extra photos. More photos, more higher frame rates would have meant more film, and that was really, really expensive. So, and not necessary, because it was gonna still look continuous. So it became a standard over time for this sort of filmic look, because that's what they used in film in order to optimize both motion and cost efficiency. However, now in the digital world, we don't have those same restrictions. So playing with different frame rates suddenly is opened up, and there's a variety of different frame rates that are used for different reasons. So where do you find your slow motion settings in your phone? I'm sure a few of you have hunted them out already. In your iPhone, you go into your settings, down to find your camera, same as before. And then the first one we're going to have a look at is 60 frames per second. It's not in your slow-mo, but it can be used for slow-mo. 1080 at 60 will allow you to do half speed at 1080 resolution. You've also got your slow-mo, record slow-mo settings, where you've got 1080 at 120 and also at 240 in a low resolution. So in Filmic Pro, you open up your settings dial, go into frame rate, and then you'll find where each one of these settings exists. The 24 to 30 are your standard film and TV frame rates. 48 to 120 are mainly for your slow motion. And Filmic Pro can also capture 240 frames per second, but only at 720. You have to reduce the resolution because it's capturing 240 images for every single second of motion, and that demands a lot of processor. So very often when you start getting into these fast frame rates, you'll get a reduction in quality in order to achieve this. Now, I'm not using the Android app for this reason. It reduced the resolution quite massively to 540 in order to achieve 120 frames per second, and the footage really doesn't cut it, unfortunately. Even though it is capturing the motion quite well, not great in terms of quality. It's not going to get us that cinematic look. So we're in slow motion now. Let's have a little look at some poi play in the park. 1080 at 30p. Now again, when you half the speed of 30, you can see what happens. This is why we don't slow down 30. When we take it now up to 60 frames per second halved, this is 30 frames per second, and then this is 60 at full speed. Look at the difference between your 60 frames per second played at 30. Now let's have a look at 1080 at 120 frames per second, quarter speed. This is all the native camera app. And now at 240. Look at that. See the people in the background, they're just melting through space. So even though you're playing it significantly slow pace, now this, it still looks continuous. So let's have a little look again at sort of stabilization with slow motion. We were talking about this before. So this is 30 frames per second handheld. Again, it's actually doing quite well. The iPhone does quite well handheld, I have to say. And this is normal speed, moving through space. Now this is at 60 frames per second, half speed, still handheld. But look how smooth the motion looks. By slowing it down, these little jitters, these little kind of little movements that you get from your hands suddenly don't become as apparent. Which is why slow motion can actually be a bit of a stabilizing tool. Going even slower now again, still handheld, you'd never know. This is 120 frames per second on the native app, but still keeping our 1080 resolution. Now bearing in mind again, we've fixed our focus, we have fixed our exposure. So we're getting the best quality footage that we can from these settings. Now in 240, again, we've had to reduce our resolution, unfortunately, to 720, but you can see the type of motion that you can get. It's still HD, but it does look a little softer, a little less sharp than our 1080 footage. It would do quite well if you were watching on your phone, for example, rather than on a bigger screen. You're going to get some quite nice motion there. We're layering on the our technical information. So we've again got it in our resolution and our quality that we like. We're working with Filmic Pro. We've got our exposure, our focus. We've got it in a nice quality. We're utilizing the Osmo, although you didn't really need it, like I said, with the handheld situation at that kind of frame rate. But just getting your lighting right, getting your settings right, and understanding what frame rates are sort of optimal for slow motion, you start to get some really nice footage. The 120 is quite good for slow motion. 60 can be grand. You can get some quite nice stuff for 60, but if you want that real sort of epic, kind of hypnotic, kind of looking cool, slow motion just makes everyone look cool. 120 is pretty good. Unless you have a phone that's capable of recording 240 at 1080, I would say that it's necessary. I'd say the reduction in resolution in order for your footage to become more cinematic isn't worth it. And even some of the phones which do shoot slow motion in 240 at 1080 sometimes use lower quality settings. So even though it's 1080, it's not 1080. It's not as high resolution. So yeah, 120 is nice. 120 is a good frame rate for working with slow motion. And it's divisible by, it's also really good because it's divisible evenly into 24 and into 30. So the numbers are easy to calculate. So we're going to have a look now at lighting and about being able to provide as much light as you can in order to optimize the resolution, in order to optimize the sort of quality and look and the sort of cleanness of the scene. And in dark conditions, you can see what is commonly known as noise. You can also see the colors aren't very bright. You know, this contrast is quite low. So let's just add some light to the scene and have a look now at that same area, that same zoomed in area. So you can see now that the noise has almost entirely disappeared. When the light is off, it's extremely noisy. When the light is on, the shot is much, much cleaner, which is going to improve the overall quality. Outdoors are great. When you're shooting outdoors, you're going to just get lower ISOs, you're going to get nicer quality footage. And again, it's quality. It's going to affect the quality of the image that you're going to get, and that's what's going to increase the cinematic look to the imagery. So in addition to improving the quality, lighting is also integral for setting the tone, setting the mood, for creating characters. Just in these examples here, just using a single light source at different distances, different angles, it can really help you to give either the character, the subject, the content, the feel that you want to translate. Let's have a look now at kind of creating a more balanced scene. So for the lighting, we have a couple of accessories. We're working with a desk lamp and a little video light in this particular instance. But we're going to start with natural light. So with natural light now, you've got to be careful about where you're positioning your subject or where you're positioning your camera in relation to this. In this particular instance, obviously there's a bright window behind it and it's really hard to get your exposure right. When it's too bright, it looks really fuzzy. It's got this haze over it, and then when you expose correctly for the window, everything goes into silhouette. Now again, you can kind of use these for creative effect in certain instances, but generally it's challenging. So we flipped it around. So now he's nicely lit by the window, but the background isn't great. The background's really fussy. So we're going somewhere in between the two. So we've got the light coming in from the side. The background here is not as bad. But let's say we did want to utilize our indoor space. Yeah, and that none of those were really working for us. We wanted the sofa, we wanted the curtains. So we're gonna have a look at how to balance out a scene. So when your subject is just lit by a single light source, generally the background is gonna look or kind of separate to them. If you have the light source further away from them, it's gonna light more of the scene and create more of a wash, which is helpful. But still, kind of having a few extra lights in there is just gonna help to bring a little bit more harmony into the scene. So let's have a little look here. We're going to throw a little bit of light in the background so it doesn't look quite as dark, gives a bit more dimension, and then we have our single light in front. Now what else can we change? Aha! So now, by changing the colour of the shirts, this is a costume element there as well, warm and friendlier, as opposed to this. And I can see again this noise that comes into play when we add our lights. That noise that we have in the background pretty much disappears. So when we add more light to our scene, our ISO drops and we get lots of light. And then even with multiple lights, you can still play with different angles. So let's have a little look at building a scene here. So we're starting with our base light. There's pretty much nothing there. So we've got a little light behind there, adds a little bit of dimension to the hair, and then another light in front. You can have a little play with what angles you prefer, but just having a look there, the difference in quality. So you can see there, our little scene just kind of start to come together, just starting to play with the possibilities that lighting will offer you. So just going to do a little bit of a summary there. Again, there's a lot of information, and we're not looking for you to kind of take every single one of these notes on board, but just to begin your investigation into your phone, into your filmmaking process, and just seeing what little, even just a couple of adjustments there that you could use that will help to get really nice footage from your phone. So yeah, if I could say one thing, your exposure and your focus, if you could get those right, that would be fab. If I could recommend one additional thing for you to get in order to get the most from your footage, I would highly recommend Filmic Pro. It's not cheap for an app. It is $16.99, but the things that you can do with it, the customizability that you have, the full control that you have over your images, the filmic frame rates, the filmic resolutions, the filmic aspect ratios, and the stabilization, all of these elements, being able to expose your focus and your exposure and your focus separately, all of these elements mean you really can get some really nice footage from your phone. I would check out as well, if you can, the Filmic Pro website. They have, in particular, their Filmic Fest competition. If you have a look for just Filmic Fest online and have a look on their opening page, they've got all their contest winners. It's a competition that Filmic Pro runs for people who are making videos with their smartphones and using their app. And some of the footage, some of the films there are just incredible. And these are people who, you know, they will have teams around them. They will have people recording audio, and they'll have people lighting their scenes, and they'll have, you know, lots of people involved with costume and with makeup and all these elements. But the quality of the footage that you can obtain nowadays with your phone is just amazing. And this app really does go a long way to supporting that growth, which I think is great. It's supporting putting filmmaking in your hands, you know, in your pocket, and carrying it around with you on a daily basis. With regards to sort of post-production, I would far prefer working on a computer to working on my phone, to editing on my phone, because I like to be really, really precise about when I'm cutting in my movies and what kind of imagery I'm trying to get out from them. So I would highly recommend beginning your editing journey on a desktop or laptop computer rather than doing it through your phones. It would just be my recommendation. There are many free, like genuinely free desktop programs, which are really good. So I'm going to mention a few of those. So obviously Apple again has iMovie, completely free, comes on with all of their Macs and laptops. And it's I've got to say, for a free app, it's great. You can do loads and loads with it. There's one which is purely for PC, which is called VSCD, which is completely free and is PC only, and is quite good if you don't have a very powerful PC. Editing is one of the most power intensive things you can ask your computer to do, so it really does demand a lot from it. So the VSCD program that you can download, it's pretty good for low processing. There's also one called, and again, completely free, available on Apple and on PCs, called OpenShot, and another one called Shotcut. I haven't used Shotcut, but I have used OpenShot, and it was grand. A little tricky in some areas, but pretty decent. There's a lot of effects there that you can apply. It's got the speed adjustments. You can letterbox your videos in order to get your widescreen effect if you want to use that. You've got basic cuts and transitions and things like that. And they'd be good ones to get you started. There are more advanced software there are more advanced free software available for, again, Mac and PC, which might take a little bit more time to learn, but if you start getting interested in filmmaking, they're great. There's DaVinci Resolve, another one called Lightworks, and another one called Hit Film Express. They are a bit more labor intensive. They will work your computer a lot harder, so you just have to make sure that you've got a computer that's kind of capable of using them. But if you start getting into video, they can do some really advanced things, so you can have a play with those and see how they feel. In addition to the equipment that we were using, like the kind of gimbals that we were playing with, we were working with the DJI brand, the Osmo Mobile 2, and we also had the Mobile 3. But there are a good number of other gimbal brands available that are doing great stuff. There's Gian, which does things like the Gian Smooth, Q2, the 4, the X. There's another brand called Moza, which does the Gimbal and Moza Mini, and another one called Tech, which does the Vlog Pocket, the Gimbal, and the SPG2. So these are all different types of handheld mobile gimbals, and they range in price from around about sort of 60 to kind of 120, depending on what you're looking at. And also, I mean, look for secondhand gear. I'm always a big fan on reusing things, so absolutely look for gear, on adverts and things like that. And if you want to sort of see about getting one that's a little cheaper, because they're not cheap devices, but they really can make really beautiful footage from your images. So yeah, there's a lot of information there, I know. So Shane and myself are currently on Facebook on the Fresh Film site if you want to ask us any questions, anything specific to things you're trying out, to things that you'd like to do a certain thing but you're not quite sure, or you'd be like, explain this thing again, I didn't quite get it. That's fine too. Then yeah, we're there and we're having a chat. So thank you very, very much for your time today. Hopefully next year we'll be able to do something in person where we'll be able to kind of interact and see the kind of footage that you guys are making. I'm really excited to see more filmmaking happening across Ireland, so make it happen. So yeah, thank you. Enjoy the rest of Cruinniú. Attend as many workshops as you possibly can. It's great fun, and right from your the comfort of your own home this year. So have a lovely Cruinniú and enjoy the rest of your day.